The early morning sky over Atlanta carried a faint chill, the kind that gently brushed against the skin as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Everything seemed to wear a golden hue, soft and tender, as if the day itself was waking up. The serene quiet was interrupted only by the chirping of birds and the metallic clinking of shopping carts bumping together on the rough pavement of the parking lot. A sleek black SUV rolled smoothly into the grocery store parking lot. The vehicle came to a stop, and out stepped a towering figure, Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend known affectionately as Big Shaq. His massive frame and ever-present smile usually made him the center of attention wherever he went. But today, there was a quietness in his demeanor, a thoughtful weight behind his eyes. Pulling his coat a little tighter, Shaq took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. Today, amidst a packed schedule, he had carved out a rare moment to run a simple errand himself, a luxury he seldom had. But just as he was about to step into the store, something stopped him in his tracks. At the far end of the parking lot, an elderly man, perhaps 89 years old, was struggling to push a long row of shopping carts. His oversized uniform made him appear even smaller, his thin shoulders hunched as though burdened by more than just the weight of the carts. Every step he took seemed heavy, deliberate, and his bony hands barely peeked out from the long sleeves of his uniform. Despite the chill in the air, sweat dotted his wrinkled forehead, glistening under the morning light. Shaq stood frozen, his eyes locked on the old man. A wave of emotion washed over him, compassion mixed with curiosity. Why is someone this old doing such grueling work? Without hesitation, Shaq found himself walking toward the man, his long strides purposeful. Bending slightly to meet the man's gaze, Shaq's deep voice carried both warmth and concern. "Hey, big guy, need some help with that?" The man paused, lifting his weathered face to meet Shaq's eyes. A flicker of surprise passed through his tired gaze, but it quickly softened into a kind smile. "Thanks, son. I've got it. Been doing this for a while now," the man replied, his voice slow but steady. Shaq returned the smile, but his heart ached. This man, someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone who had likely worked hard his entire life, was still battling the grind of life in his twilight years. "How long have you been working here?" Shaq asked, his tone light and careful, trying not to make the man feel uncomfortable. The elderly man let out a faint sigh and leaned slightly against the row of carts, as though taking a brief moment to rest. "Name's Henry," he said, his voice measured and calm. "Been here a few years now, just part-time, but it helps pay the rent and keeps food on the table. It's enough." Henry's words felt like a gentle blow to Shaq's chest, a subtle but piercing reminder of life's inequities. Part of him wanted to ask more, but the weariness in Henry's eyes held him back. "Henry," Shaq began again, his voice slower, softer. "If you didn't have to do this, if you could do anything, what would it be?" Henry's gaze shifted to the distance, his eyes misting as he seemed to pull memories from the depths of his mind. After a moment, he spoke, his voice tinged with emotion. "Probably go fishing. My wife always wanted us to do that together, but she passed before we got the chance. Life doesn't always give you a second shot, you know." Shaq stood silently, his towering frame suddenly feeling small in the presence of Henry's quiet strength and sorrow. The weight of Henry's words lingered in the crisp morning air. A story of love lost, dreams deferred, and a life that had given more than it had taken. "Wait here for me, Henry," Shaq said firmly, yet gently. "I'll be right back." Henry nodded faintly, his expression a mix of curiosity and resignation. Shaq turned and strode quickly toward the store, his mind racing with thoughts. "I have to do something. I can't just walk away from this." Shaq entered the brightly lit store, the familiar hum of background music and the clinking of shopping carts filling the air. But the mundane surroundings couldn't distract him from the image of Henry. Frail, steady, and quietly enduring. This isn't right. He shouldn't have to live like this, Shaq thought, his steps slow but deliberate as he moved down the aisles. Pulling a shopping basket, he began adding a few items: a carton of eggs, a gallon of milk, a couple of protein bars. The items seemed ordinary, but in Shaq's mind, they were part of something bigger. Stopping at the hot food section, Shaq's eyes landed on the golden, steaming breakfast sandwiches. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, warming his resolve. He picked up 2 sandwiches and 2 cups of coffee, the heat radiating through his hands. As he stood in line at the checkout, Shaq felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about breakfast. It was about something far greater. This is just the beginning, he whispered to himself, a quiet but powerful resolve building within him. At the checkout counter, the cashier looked up and instantly recognized her towering customer. Her face lit up with a warm smile. "Great to see you this morning, Mr. O'Neill." Shaq nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. But unlike his usual friendly demeanor, he didn't linger to chat. Instead, he picked up his bag of groceries, his gaze fixed on the parking lot where Henry was still diligently working. Shaq walked out of the store, his steps firm and purposeful, carrying not just the bag of food but a growing resolve. As he approached, his deep voice carried a warmth that cut through the morning air. "Henry, take a break. I brought you something warm to eat." Henry looked up, his tired eyes widening in surprise as they landed on Shaq, holding 2 breakfast sandwiches and steaming cups of coffee. A faint smile flickered across his weathered face, but it was accompanied by hesitation. "You didn't have to do that, son." "I'm fine, really," Henry replied, his voice soft and unsure. Shaq smiled back, his tone gentle yet resolute. "No, I needed to do this. Come on, my friend. It's time to rest for a moment." Henry hesitated, glancing back at the carts as if reluctant to abandon his post. But eventually, he nodded and carefully aligned the row of carts before making his way to a nearby bench where Shaq had already set the food down. Shaq handed Henry a sandwich and a cup of coffee. Henry's frail hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the foil around the warm sandwich. The aroma rose, mingling with the cool morning air, and seemed to ease the chill that had settled into Henry's bones. "Thank you, Shaq," Henry said softly, his voice raspy with emotion. "I can't remember the last time someone did something like this for me." Shaq sat beside him, holding his own coffee but keeping his focus on Henry. His voice dropped to a quieter, more serious tone. "Henry, I want to ask you something," he began. "If you could do anything, what would it be?" Henry paused, his chewing slowing as his eyes drifted to the distance. For a moment, it seemed like he was peering into a memory long buried. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling but full of longing. "I'd go fishing. My wife always wanted us to do that together, but she passed before we ever got the chance. Sometimes, life doesn't give you a second shot." Shaq sat silently for a moment, absorbing the weight of Henry's words. It wasn't just about fishing. It was about a lifetime of sacrifice, unfulfilled dreams, and the grief of losing someone you loved deeply. Gently placing his coffee down, Shaq turned to face Henry directly. His voice was firm, carrying both resolve and compassion. "Henry, that changes today. I can't stand by and watch you keep doing this. You've worked hard your whole life. It's time for you to live." Henry's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. There was a flicker of disbelief in his tired eyes, mingling with gratitude and emotion. Before he could respond, Shaq stood up, his hand reaching into his pocket as his mind solidified the plan that had been forming since he first saw Henry. Standing tall, Shaq's gaze never left Henry. The morning light cast a soft glow over Henry's frail figure, a testament to resilience and the wear of time. This wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a moment of transformation. "You've spent your whole life sacrificing for your family, for others," Shaq began, his deep voice steady yet filled with compassion. It's time you finally receive what you deserve, Henry. Henry froze, his weathered hands tightening around the warm cup of coffee as his eyes slowly rose to meet Shaq's. What do you mean by that? He asked, his voice trembling slightly, as though afraid to believe what was about to happen. Shaq slowly pulled his hand out of his pocket, revealing a neat stack of crisp $100 bills. Sitting down beside Henry, he placed the money carefully on the bench between them. Henry, I want you to take this, Shaq said firmly. Use it for rent, groceries, or whatever you need. Most importantly, use it to live more comfortably. You don't need to work here another day. Henry stared at the stack of money, his eyes wide with shock and emotion. His frail hands trembled as he instinctively reached toward it, only to pull back. Shaking his head, he stammered, Shaq, I can't take this. It's too much. I'm not worthy. I can't. You can, and you will, Shaq replied, his tone gentle but resolute. This isn't charity, Henry. It's a thank you for everything you've done in your life. You've worked hard. You've sacrificed everything. And now it's time for you to live for yourself. Henry bowed his head, tears streaming silently down his deeply lined face. His hands trembled as they finally grasped the money, clutching it tightly as though it might disappear if he let go. Shaq, he choked out, his voice breaking with emotion. You haven't just given me money today. You've given me so much more. You've given me hope. A hope I thought I had lost a long time ago. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder, a warm smile lighting up his face. Henry, you never lost hope. It was always there, waiting for someone to help it shine again. And today, that light belongs to you. Shaq leaned in closer, his expression serious but filled with affection. But Henry, I need you to promise me something, he said. Henry looked up, his tear-filled eyes glistening with gratitude. Promise? What kind of promise, Shaq? Shaq smiled, his voice soft yet unwavering. Promise me that from now on, you'll work less and live more. Read the books you and your wife always wanted to read together. And take me fishing. I've never been fishing before, and I think you'd be the best guide I could ever ask for. Henry laughed through his tears, a sound that mixed joy and disbelief. You really want me to take you fishing, Shaq? He asked, his eyes reflecting a happiness he hadn't felt in years. I don't just want it. I'm looking forward to it, Shaq replied, his voice brimming with sincerity. Henry bowed his head again, his trembling hands wiping away the tears streaming down his face. Thank you, Shaq, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise you, I'll live differently. For her. For me. Shaq stood up, his hand still resting on Henry's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. His radiant smile seemed to brighten the morning even more. That's the spirit, Henry. We'll make it happen. Soon. Henry nodded, his face still damp with tears, but now illuminated by a newfound hope. As Shaq stepped away, his towering figure heading back to his SUV, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight on his shoulders finally lift. For the first time in years, he felt a lightness in his heart, a sense that life still held something beautiful for him. Shaq stood there, gazing at Henry with unwavering determination and sincerity. The air seemed to still around them, as if the world had paused to witness this small but profoundly meaningful moment of change. Henry, I need you to promise me something, Shaq said, his deep voice warm, yet carrying a weight of seriousness. Henry looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and surprise. Promise? What kind of promise, Shaq? He asked softly, sensing that this wasn't going to be just any promise. Shaq leaned in slightly, his large hands resting gently on Henry's frail shoulders. His steady gaze locked onto Henry's weary but wise eyes, the lines etched by years of toil. You need to promise me that from this day forward, you'll work less and live more. Do the things you and your wife always dreamed of doing. Take the time to read the books she loved. And one more thing. Shaq paused, his serious expression softening into a playful smile, lightening the moment. You've got to take me fishing. I've never been, and if anyone's going to teach me, it has to be you. Henry froze for a moment, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Then, like a gentle wave washing over a rocky shore, a quiet joy began to rise. It softened the weariness in his gaze, melting away years of fatigue. You really want me to take you fishing, Shaq? Henry asked, chuckling lightly, his voice a blend of amusement and emotion. Someone like you, learning from someone like me. Shaq nodded firmly, his smile growing even warmer. Exactly, Henry. I want to learn from the best. And more than that, I want to see you smile more. You've given so much to others. Now it's time to live for yourself. Henry lowered his head, his trembling hands clutching the stack of money Shaq had given him. Slowly, tears began to fall. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of release, an unburdening of a weight he'd carried for too long. Shaq, Henry said, his voice trembling as he struggled to speak. I never believed I'd have hope again. But you've brought it back. You've given me a reason to live, a reason to believe in tomorrow. Shaq gently squeezed Henry's shoulder, his voice calm yet filled with resolve. That's what you deserve, Henry. Not just for today, but for all the days to come. Promise me. Promise you'll live a life full of joy. And don't forget about our fishing trip. Henry wiped the tears from his face, his hands steadier now. When he looked up at Shaq, his eyes shone with a light that hadn't been there in years. It was the glow of renewed hope and the anticipation of a brighter future. I promise, Shaq, Henry said, his voice shaky but stronger. I'll live differently. I'll live for her. And for me. And I'll make sure our fishing trip will be the best one you've ever had. Shaq laughed heartily, the sound breaking through the lingering heaviness of the morning. That's the spirit! I'll be waiting, Henry. But don't make me wait too long. Henry joined in the laughter, his chuckle soft but genuine, carrying with it a happiness he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt the burdens on his shoulders lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and purpose. Shaq stood up, his gaze still fixed on Henry. Before turning to leave, his voice broke the stillness, steady and warm. We've just started a new journey, Henry, and it's going to be so much better from here. Henry watched him, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel alone or powerless. He clutched the stack of money in his hands, holding onto it like it was the embodiment of the hope Shaq had just reignited in his life. As Shaq began walking away, he paused and turned back, his eyes meeting Henry's one more time. The small elderly man sat on the bench, holding onto the money like it might disappear at any moment. Henry, don't forget your promise, Shaq said, his radiant smile lighting up his face. I'm looking forward to our fishing trip. You're the only guide I trust. Henry chuckled, a warm, genuine laugh escaping his lips for the first time in years. You have my word, Shaq. I won't let you down. Shaq nodded and stepped into his sleek black SUV. The engine hummed to life, but before driving away, he waved to Henry one last time. Henry remained on the bench, his eyes following Shaq's car as it disappeared down the road. The morning sun bathed his face in warmth, illuminating his gentle, newfound smile. He looked down at the stack of money in his hands. But what filled his heart wasn't just relief from financial strain. It was something far greater. It was the sense of hope he thought he'd lost long ago. A soft breeze whispered through the air, carrying with it a sound that felt so familiar. It was like his late wife's voice, gentle and loving, a reminder he'd always held close. It's going to be okay, Henry. You deserve to be happy. Henry closed his eyes, his lips curving into a tender smile. You're right, my love. Everything is okay now, he murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. I'll live well. For you. For myself. As the sun rose higher, warming the day, Henry felt a renewed energy coursing through him. The heavy burden he had carried for so long seemed to fade. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream of the books his wife had adored, of the fishing trips they'd always planned but never taken. Yes, he whispered to himself, his voice steady and resolute. It's time to live for me. The narration begins, soft and heartfelt, as the camera captures Henry sitting peacefully on the bench, the sunlight illuminating his serene expression. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change a life forever. The story of Shaq and Henry isn't just about generosity. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to bring hope to someone else, even with a simple gesture.